Who else shall cry out if not us? So I did a stream earlier in the week with Matt Forney about the fact that the Pope has just put heresy into the catechism. I'm not going to be digging into that topic. There's a 30-minute live stream. You guys can look that up. I've discussed it with Beckloff. I've discussed it with John Steele. It's an issue. It's an ongoing issue, but I'm not going to be going into details about that. I told you people that when I went to church today, I was going to confront my priest about this and say, what does it mean that I reject one paragraph in the catechism? Not that I'm ignoring it because I'm a sinful human being, but that I'm outright saying, this is evil. I refuse to acknowledge this. I call this un-Catholic. Well, I had that conversation with my priest, and he didn't want to take a stance on it. He neither told me that I'm not welcome in the church, nor did he tell me that I was right in my discernment here. Instead, he asked me to follow up by email, which I did. And I also plan to follow up with the Bishop of Calgary, not for my sake, but for the 16,000 people that choose to follow this channel. I'm not looking at this for myself. I'm looking at it for you. But this is the issue I want to discuss. The fact that my priest, and he's a very good priest. He has the grace of discernment. He has been a very good priest to me. But when I brought up this issue, he didn't want to deal with it. You know, when I woke up this morning, slept in a little bit, I said to myself, I don't want to go to church. I don't want to deal with this. After church, I didn't want to confront my priest. Who am I? Who am I, 36-year-old parishioner, to confront this older man that has done so much, that knows the Bible so much better than I do, that performs sacraments? Who am I? Well, I'll tell you who I am. I'm the man that called out the false cult of Keck. I'm the one who called out the satanic inversion that had entered into the chaos magicians of 8chan. I called it out, and I sucked the wind out of that demon's sails. I'm the man that has 16,000 of you that think I have something worthy of saying. I am the man that broke my hand in battle with a direwolf, or a Malamute, if you prefer. And for those of you that have read the book of Daniel, that understand the affairs of angels are far more complex than we understand, and those of you that are familiar with the Indo-European mythos, those of you who are familiar with Tyr and recognize the fact that he may just be one of the angelic beings, I'm the man who was blessed by he that put his hand in the wolf Fenris's mouth. I have met his approval. I'm Davis Aurini, a soldier with an intuitive understanding of every weapon I've ever picked up. I don't know how guns operate, but when I pick them up, I know how they operate. The knowledge is graced to me by the Lord. And furthermore, not only has he given me a great intellect, he's also given me the grace of vision and discernment. That is who I am. And that is why I am going to call this out. Because if we don't call it out, who is going to call it out? Isn't it so much easier to let it go, to play nice, to pretend that there's nothing wrong in the world whatsoever? Isn't it easy to sit back and pretend that Uncle Bad Touch at Thanksgiving didn't molest little Sally Sue? Isn't it easy to cover up the sins within your own institution and just transfer them to a different area, whether it be the church or a university? Isn't it easy to pretend that the constant demands for the death of whites, it's just some angry minorities, it doesn't matter? Isn't it easy to pretend that the current path we're on won't involve all of us dying alone in a old folks home with nobody to mourn us but the nurse that speaks English as a second language? We have a couple of super chats right off the bat. Let me get to these. First is Dashing Rogues, US $5. Priests are bureaucrats, Davis. Change comes from the bottom up. I've spoken to priests who state that they have no choice but to follow the catechisms. Some are standing up. Others, like my priest, he is very focused on the salvation of souls, not church politics. This is why he is just a priest and not a bishop, because he cares about men and women. So, yeah, I agree, however, that we need to be the ones to speak up. Tom Bombadil sends US $4.99, says Keck totally died down since then. Exactly. Keck was prepared to turn the entire dissident right into Charlottesville. Look at how many views my video on that got. I'm also the man that in 2014 predicted the current civil war, which Robertson, who has joined us, has written about. We'll be getting to that shortly. And folks, there's one more thing I need to state before we really get the show rolling. Hathrune's mother is in the hospital right now, and I ask that you folks pray for her. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Hathrune.
Sorry, I had to unmute my mic there. I didn't want to interrupt you talking. Yeah, my mother was hospitalized late Friday night. She had to have emergency surgery. That's all I really want to say on it. But your thoughts and prayers are very much appreciated. Thank you.
So guys, please do pray for her. Now, Robertson, you wrote a piece recently on countercurrents. It's linked down below, and I thought it was absolutely excellent. You were describing the Civil War, and you pointed out that's already happening. You quoted Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. Okay, just because the guns aren't out yet, oh no, they're just getting you kicked off of the internet and fired from your job and trying to drive you to the point of suicide. You know, will you recognize the Civil War when it shows up on your front door? And I also think you aptly described what the sides of this conflict are going to be. The defining line in the sand here is pro-European civilization and anti-European civilization. Put it very simply, pro-white and anti-white. Doesn't mean that it's white versus everyone else. It's pro-white. There are minorities, there's non-whites that are pro-white, and there are plenty of whites that are anti-white. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Sure. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Yeah, no, my wife and I were watching this show, Wild Wild Country, which was a fantastic documentary on the rise and fall of Rajneeshpuram in Antelope, Oregon. And I think what stood out to me most by the very end of the show was that when they erected that monument to the not the survivors, because there wasn't like a lot of violence, but to the resilient residents who stuck it out and resisted the influence of the Rajneeshis. The memorial thanked and acknowledged the people as survivors of an invasion and of an occupation. And looking back in hindsight, it was very clear that it had been an invasion and an occupation, but no one understood what was happening as it was going on, as it was happening. And anyone who has read the 4 Generations of Modern War by Lind and Thiel, or the shorter 4th Generation Warfare Handbook, will know that warfare doesn't always look like it does in the movies. Oftentimes, warfare is, and the Israeli military historian Martin Ben Krevel, I think, summarized it quite aptly. Sometimes invasion and warfare are functionally the same. Now, we're obviously experiencing great deals of migration, but we're also experiencing, separate from the migration and the immigration, sorts of political philandering and manipulation and aggression that is not politics as usual. And warfare is, from this perspective, more a state of mind than it is a set of clearly identifiable actions. You know, it's easy to say whether something's comedy or not, but it's hard to put a definition on it. Warfare is kind of like that too, and I feel like the right wing is about 2 decades behind the left in getting into that mindset, and it only takes one to start a war.
There was an article today by the Z-Man, or the Z-Man as we call him in Soviet Kanakistan, about this Sarah Jiang nonsense. So briefly, if you guys haven't heard about this, I'm sure you probably have. Sarah Jiang is this Korean woman that loves posting all this anti-white hate, bitterness, white people smell like dogs. I'm going to make an app so dumb white people can figure out how to make rice. It's literally an app that shows you where they sell a rice maker. Just all of this very virulent, angry, stupid, and ongoing. She did this for years. She was recently hired by the New York Times, and the New York Times, they actually wrote a justification of her behavior, and they were so hasty in getting it out, they just screen capped something they wrote in Word, and you can even see the cursor is still blinking in it. And what the Z-Man is pointing out is that this is really forcing you to acknowledge what's going on. Because the Asians are the model minority, aren't they? The Asians are the ones that come here and get educations and pay taxes, and you know, like the blacks get angry at us. Well, it's because they come from poor neighborhoods. The Mexicans, you know, same thing. They have to work day labor. They're just angry. They're not really angry at white people. So just roll over and play dead white person. They're not really angry at you. They're just frustrated with their economic circumstances. Well, here we have an Asian woman hired by the New York Times. Of course, Ben Shapiro is bending over to apologize for her as well. You know, at what point are you going to wake up, Normie? This woman has had all the blessings of Western civilization, and she hates the founders of Western civilization. Of course, this is not all Asians, okay? But this is the side, pro-European, anti-European.
Yes. I was asked about this. I was on Luke Ford's stream earlier today, and I was asked about this. By the way, go check that out on his channel if you haven't already. It was pretty fun. And I said, I don't care if the Times hires her, you know. This will make it, I mean, the media we're already in a position where a large number of Americans, white Americans, do not trust the news media. They view it as inimical to their interests. I mean, we've seen this invisible terms ever since Trump was campaigning 2 years ago. But stuff like this will make it super obvious to the normies. You know, the New York Times is abandoning all pretense of objectivity and revealing themselves to be an anti-white, anti-American newspaper. That makes it very clear for the cheap seats who's in charge, who's running this, how these people feel about you. I should add with Sarah Jiang, to the whole model minority thing. Sarah Jiang is, by any objective standard, she's not very attractive. Like, she's a 4 on her best day. But an interesting thing, if you comb her tweets, the vast majority of her relationships seem to have been with white men. My working observation
didn't she have a history with Weave? Like, I've seen one of the speculations is the reason she's so angry at white men is because Weave wouldn't have sex with her.
Yeah, see, I was actually about to bring that up. She wants the most desirable, like, attractive white men, but she can't get them because she's not attractive enough. So she's stuck with all these weird soy boy losers who eat vegan and make the new male grin when they have their Nintendo Switch, and are just all in all pretty repulsive individuals. So she transmutes her hatred onto whites in general because she wants so desperately to be part of white culture, but she just can't make it. despite all of her success. She's always going to be on the outside looking in.
Well, quite frankly, I think that's the hatred of European civilization. They don't hate us for our flaws. They hate us for our virtues. Okay, like, yes, European civilization has flaws, and we've gone down a lot of wrong paths. But despite that, Europe is the most successful, it is the grandest civilization the planet has ever seen. We put men on the moon.
And
And
I was going to say, what you're describing there isn't hate, it's envy.
Well, the two things can be relatively close, hatred and envy. Hatred comes from a sense of something that you love being threatened. So if the existence of something else threatens your conception of yourself, then it's natural. I suppose you could say envy is a kind of hatred, but she doesn't want what we have. She just wants it gone.
How is it a threat to which she believes she values?
Well, I mean, imagine you are a part of a civilization that you are quite proud of, but your next door neighbor has created something that is objectively, grander or more beautiful or more functional. That next door neighbor's culture may still be alien to you. You may not want it, but the proximity that makes you feel inferior, that it's not quite the same thing as envy. Well, at least when I think about envy, the connotation is desiring what someone else has, covetousness. Like I wish I had that too. Whereas if you just want something else to be destroyed because it threatens your own self-conception or something that you love, it's hard for people to wrap their heads around it. I think that this idea of just wanting to destroy something. But it's a real emotion, and I think we've invested ourselves too heavily against hatred as an emotion that can never be moral, and so we don't understand it very well.
This is why it says don't covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's goods. It doesn't say don't want what your neighbors have. There's a very silly line from oh good Lord, Mr. Conductor, where he proceeds to disprove the 10 Commandments, where he says that wanting what your neighbor has is the basis of the free market economy. No, if your neighbor has a beautiful wife and a beautiful house, it is good to want those things for yourself. Covetousness is when you are angry at your neighbor for having something you can't. And so rather than earn what your neighbor has, you seek to destroy it. And like, this is the basis of Marxism. This is the basis of postmodernism, of feminism, of penis envy, of all of these. Like in the dissident right, we've been talking about all of these toxic systems, and I think they're finally coming together. They are amalgamating. Due to Trump, they're all amalgamating into one thing, and it is pure covetousness.
I was just trying to nail down the core emotion, because I understand that hatred is what these things lead to, but I think what you described, Christopher, the second way you described it would actually be fear. It's a fear of something. Well, actually, if it's a threat, then it would be a fear. That the fear's leading to the hatred, or the envy's leading to the hatred, but the hatred seems more of an effect and not a cause.
Possibly. And there's a lot of different facets of hatred, to be sure.
Sure.
Mandy up above in the comment section said that love and hatred are two sides of the same coin. I don't want to self-promote too shamelessly, but my book, In Defense of Hatred, goes over some of that stuff.
Okay.
Please feel free to shamelessly self-promote. I saw that book, and I'm curious about it.
Well, part of the reason I don't want to shamelessly self-promote either is that I was a much stronger Christian when I wrote it very, very recently, and so my sort of desperation to merge those two things led to some rather bad theology working its way into that book. So I think the core argument I make is still good, but it's not the best book out there, we'll say.
Actually, interesting. I'll just mention this. The way that Chris and I got into contact is he wrote some very very good critiques of what's going on in Christianity right now, and he was hoping that I could debate him. I unfortunately cannot. They are good critiques. I would like somebody to prove them wrong. And I think you kind of said you would like to be proved wrong as well, I believe.
Very much so.
So I don't have an answer to that. Although I will say, well, first of all, part of me is very glad. Part of my faith is reaffirmed at what has happened with the catechism. Because this is, again, the title of the content of the stream, you know, are we going to speak out against this? Well, now it is so blatant. This is not Pope Francis saying another idiotic thing that can be misinterpreted. This is black and white. This is the catechism. This demands a stance. Same thing with Jiang. Okay, when an angry black man from the ghetto is screaming about Whitey, well, I mean, look at where he comes from. Of course he's pissed off. When Jiang is entirely privileged her entire life, and she has a job at the New York Times, and even then, she is filled with this envy and bitterness. You know, this demands that we speak. This is what separates the wheat from the chaff. I wrote on Twitter that this is what separates the church militant from the church apathetic. If you don't care about the church being corrupted, if you don't care about society being turned against itself, if you don't care about the rampant effeminacy in the church and in the society, then we know you're our enemy. We know you don't care. That's fine. You know, Psalms 1:1, don't stand between a sinner and his sin. You go walk off that cliff. You are not of my tribe. You are not of my people. Those that do care will be standing up. I don't know how many of us care, but a lot of us do.
And I think it's important that we identify those people by their deeds and by the virtues that they adhere to, and not necessarily by their religious faith, because we're not all Christians.
Well, the church that my wife and I have been attending for the last several years has been working through the book of James, where they talk about the importance of works. And I wouldn't consider myself a Christian, but I still enjoy Christian theology. Mm-hmm. And the idea was never, a lot of atheists are very will gleefully point out that, oh, the Bible says you are saved by faith alone, and it says you're saved by faith and works. But the whole idea is that no, works don't save you, but they are the evidence that your faith is well placed and is honest. And speaking of intentions, I think it's an interesting and a very likely theory that Sarah Zhang is motivated by envy or hatred or any of these things. It's also entirely possible, or maybe both of these things, that she's just following market demands. You know, there's a large demand for anti-white sentiments. I think Babylon Bee posted recently that the New York Times stands by its recent editorial board hire Joseph Stalin, despite criticism of mass murder. You know, and they came up with a very clever, similar, like, oh, he responded to fire with fire by killing his political dissidents. But there's a market demand for anti-white sentiment, and I think it's there's becoming, and this is something maybe to look out for, a market demand for anti-white sentiment that can also get in the way of serious conversation.
Yeah, we need to be very careful about that, because one of the errors that occurred with the dissident right is, oh, the SJWs are going to call us Nazis. Well, let's put on plastic German army helmets and seek hail all over the place. Let's become the Red Skull. We don't want to countersignal the countersignalers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, speaking of which, there was a request. I was specifically requested to discuss Christopher Cantwell because, well, in the past, I used to be quite the fan of him. I tried to reach out to him when he was going through a dark place. I actually had that video taken down for hate speech because I was trying to talk a man into not committing suicide. So I guess trying to talk white people into not killing themselves is hate speech.
Wow.
So he just got out of prison, and he eventually copped to a plea bargain, which prevents him from going to, what is it, the state of Vermont or something?
Virginia.
Virginia. Nobody wants to go to that state anyway. The person that was documented to have assaulted him with pepper spray, he did the research finding this guy, and basically they said the only way they'll charge him is if Christopher Cantwell comes down to make a statement, but he's not allowed to come down to the state unless if it's under under a writ where you're demanded to come. So if he went down there to report the crime, he would be arrested for violating the conditions of his release. I'm glad he's out. I'm very glad he's out. And he's acknowledged that Charlottesville was a disaster, unlike a lot of the people, unfortunately. My worry about Cantwell is that he does not have faith. And everybody here has faith. Guys, this is a spiritual struggle. And, like what Hey Thrun commented, that not just the Christian faith. And yes, absolutely, it can't just be. Because if that's your standard, that you need to go to church, most of the people in the church don't care about the church, about the Pope uttering heresy. If you are not going to care, if you're not going to notice, if you are going to stick your head in the sand, then you don't care about the truth. But you need faith for this. And Cantwell, God bless him. And by the way, he also mentioned, I linked his podcast below, he mentioned the people that are still in prison. All right, and he gave you the information that you can write them letters, which I may very well be doing. I would encourage you guys to do so as well. Okay,
Davis, I hate to say this, but I really recommend you don't.
You don't think they'll be received well?
Don't do it unless you want to end up on like some sort of like Canadian American watch list. Just don't do it.
Oh, fair enough. You can always write anonymous letters.
Well, if you're an American, you'd probably be less at risk. But like in your case, this might be the kind of thing that get you banned from the U.S., Davis.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, actually.
Yeah, we don't want you getting banned from the U.S.
Yeah, because I'm banned from Canada. It means we'd have to, like, I guess, go to meet in Costa Rica or something.
Well, you'd have to go to one of those towns that's actually right on the border and just shout at each other from opposing Starbucks.
Well, thankfully, I don't think Davis Aurini writing letters to Cantwell would be the top of the U.S. banning list. It's actually quite hard to ban people from the United States, much harder than it is from Germany or Britain or Australia, so far as I can tell.
True, but you shouldn't take that risk, Davis, especially considering that you don't know any of these people.
That's true. I do think it was nice to see a little bit of leadership finally coming out of the Charlottesville disaster.
Cantwell should have realized this was a disaster a long time ago. I mean, just a couple short months ago, he doxed Ricky, he supported the doxing of Ricky Vaughn partially on the basis that Ricky Vaughn said Charlottesville was a disaster. The exact quote was that if Ricky Vaughn is saying those things, he should be hiding for his fucking safety, not tweeting about it.
This is why I'm glad I have you as an ally, Forney. I'm far too forgiving of people.
Cantwell is like Jim Smithraw is bringing up something I said recently on one of my streams. Cantwell is going to find himself in prison again in the next couple of years for doing something stupid. This entire experience, he learned nothing from it. He learned nothing from it. That he's taken the wrong lesson. He's going to go out and do something even dumber, and he's gonna fuck himself permanently. And there won't be anyone coming to support his fund or write him letters in jail or help co-host a show with him. He's done.
Cantwell is starting his live streams with a song that sings about gassing the Jews, and the phone number to reach him is 1-800-IM-1488.
By the way, the previous phone number he had was 1-800-GO-NAZI.
That's such a clever. That's so clever. That's how you convince people that we're not actually the Red Skull.
There was a great debate that sort of happened by proxy between Dr. Jordan Peterson and Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, I believe, both from Canada, where Ricardo Duchesne said it was important to take pride in your heritage, in your ancestors, in your ethnicity, and in your civilization. And Jordan Peterson was presented with this statement and gave his response saying, "Oh, there's a sin of pride." I wrote a little bit about this. I thought Jordan Peterson actually overstepped and misunderstood, perhaps even intentionally misunderstood Duchesne's position. But there is a serious problem with pride when it comes to the alt-right relative to conservatives. I don't think it's as bad as the problem that progressives have with pride. I don't think anyone tops them in that regard. But there is a kind of hubris in the sorts of brazen disregard for where other people are coming from, and good taste from the Weave and Cantwell and Anglin crowd.
Hey, Drew, could you give us a little lecture on the Norse words for, not braggadocio, but the words we were talking about before we started the stream? Could you explain those to the audience?
Oh, sure. They're actually Old English words. The first one is beot, and a beot is basically a resolution to accomplish a deed in the future. It amounts to taking an oath or boasting of something that you're going to do in the future. And then a yelp is something that you have already accomplished. You're boasting of deeds that you've already accomplished, or it can also be boasting of your ancestry, your tradition, something praiseworthy that has already come to pass.
Sorry to interject. Quick question regarding Beowulf. In Beowulf, there's a scene in which Beowulf makes his official boast.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the Old English. Is that this word that you're referring to here?
That is exactly it. And
Okay.
what they're doing there is they're participating in an old Anglo-Saxon ritual called Sumbel. And that was also practiced by the Old Norse as well. All the Germanic tribes practiced Sumbel. And Sumbel was a drinking ritual. The noblemen would gather in the Lord's Hall, and they would drink mead together, and they would sew bonds of frith together, and they would speak of great deeds that had been done and of great deeds that they would be doing in the future, thus the tradition of beots and yelps.
The latter
Okay.
is what I started off the live stream with, folks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wanted to address this because, again, there is a great effeminacy in the church. There's a great sickness and quite a bit. And by the way, effeminacy, I do not mean feminine. Okay, if you look at somebody wearing a frilly shirt and say, "Dude, that's a very effeminate shirt," you're saying it's a very feminine looking shirt. In theological circles, effeminacy does not mean feminine. It means addicted to pleasure. I recently told my Chad friend that his addiction to sex is very effeminate. And so the addiction to pleasure, again, it's easier not to call this stuff out. It's easier not to speak up about any of this stuff. It would have been easier for me to either not go to church or just to not confront my priest. That would have been very effeminate because it would have been addicted to pleasure, the feeling of being nice. Now, when it comes to pride, when we talk about when Christians talk about pride, the sin of pride, that word is being given a second meaning, very much the same way that effeminacy has a secondary meaning in theological circles. Pride in your race, pride in your accomplishments, these are not pride in the theological sense. And Dash and Rogue sends a super chat. Pride needs to be more defined when it comes to the term. Vainglory is not good pride. Exactly. The pride that Christians speak about is hubris, as Chris mentioned. It's vainglory, as Dashing Rogue mentioned. I have a video coming out tomorrow. It's kind of a follow-up to the requested video I did. And one of the things I point out is the reason conservatives can't seem to conserve anything is because we don't know what it means to be a European. And so many of these distant right movements, they take pride in their heritage, but they don't know what their heritage is.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And there's a tricky catch-22 with not knowing who you are as well, because if you get too invested in investigating the past and in in finding your own personal identity in the past rather than in the present, then that can be a symptom of not having an authentic identity and trying to replace it with something inauthentic. True authentic identities and self-knowledge is an organic thing that's connected to the past but isn't obsessed with it. And it's a very tricky line to walk, and a balance, especially in a society as disconnected as we are.
Right. You bring up a great point there, and this ties in with my own Viking Germanic tradition. We had an oral tradition among the elder Germanic peoples that was passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. And what you're describing there, that disconnection that makes one tend to obsess over the past instead of worthing himself in the present and taking pride in that, is because that bridge has been taken out. And I attribute this, and I think some of you would agree, maybe all of you would agree, to fatherlessness. The absence of the fathers has resulted in this lost generation that's disconnected from its own heritage.
Hey, Thrun, if I don't want to, I'm going to say something about where you've been recently with your difficulties. I'm not going to say too much, but folks, hey, Thrun has been thrust into the role of masculinity here. She is the one that's being forced to be the strong one, to be the pillar, because we don't have men anymore. This is why I said, if this is what we're going to be, if we are just going to play nice, if we're going to be effeminate, we're going to go along to get along, if we are not going to be men, then we're all dying alone in an old folks' home with nobody to mourn us. We need men to be forming civilization. We need to be taking this responsibility. There's an article I read. I'm not going to say where it was, because I understand where the writer was coming from. It was talking about how these Instagram models are describing themselves as goddesses, and thirsty beta males are sucking up and treating them like goddesses. And again, this is more effeminacy. But the article was attacking the women. It was exclusively, guys, this is what women become when there are no real men. When women are forced to fend for themselves, when they can't trust men to treat them with dignity, when they can't trust men to protect them, when we believe the lie of feminism, that women are completely free and equal, and we use them, this is what they become. We need men being strong. And it's not easy being strong. Listen, Matt, one of the things that I absolutely despise it when feminists decide to ridicule the fragility of masculinity. Yeah, you're damn right it's fragile. Any man that has put his body between the horrors of war and the safety of home knows perfectly well how fragile his body is. And yet we do it. That is what men do. We stand up and be strong, even though we aren't. And if we don't do this, if we don't have the gumption to call out the Pope when he's in heresy, if we don't have the cojones to call out this genocidal sentiment that's rife throughout society, if we don't have the dignity to be men and take care of our women folk, then we've already lost. Who shall cry out if not us?
Yeah, and it's so easy to get caught in this binary trap of thinking either men are responsible or women are responsible. And so if you hold yourself responsible for creating the market demand for these Instagram models, then the women aren't responsible. Or if you hold women responsible for kind of whoring themselves out on the internet, then you're letting the men who generate that demand off the hook. Well, it's entirely possible to hold both parties accountable and to say women need to be better, and also men stop making this happen at the same time. It's the thing I think many people misunderstand about Jocko Willink's absolute uh, absolutely personal perspective on responsibility. It doesn't mean other people aren't responsible. It just means you're taking the responsibility that you have first and letting other people worry about the things that you're not responsible for.
Right. But the types of people that you're describing there, Christopher, are the damaged children that result from fatherlessness, both the boys and the girls. So they're wandering the wilderness in ignorance, acting out on pure instinct, in most cases, acting out because they haven't been invested in by a paternal figure. So in that state, they really can't lift themselves up. They need a paternal figure to mentor them, to invest in them, to well, in the case of the boys, help bring them up, and in the case of the girls, help them to see their feminine value and protect it and honor it.
Well, that's a fair point, and I suppose I can't speak to not being a woman. I have not a very great insight into the female mentality, but I know among young men, the way to lift them out of that is not to reach out and be a father to them in a helicopter parent fashion. Is to be a father in the inspirational sense, to do things that draw them towards you and inspire them to emulate those great actions. And
Right.
again, I'm not sure if that would apply in the case of Instagram models. I can only speak to what I know, which is
No, you're right. You're right. But even in a family situation where there is an actual father there, the role of the father, as I've observed it, is to, in fact, model and encourage, as you have described. And that acts upon the boy's development. For girls, it is different. The father is needed to impress upon the girl, one, what her feminine value is, so that she's aware of it, because without that, she won't know it. And she'll either fall into a lack of self-value, where she undervalues herself and she behaves thoughtlessly and promiscuously, or she will overestimate her value and have a sense of entitlement. And the other thing that fatherless girls tend to do, I had it on the tip of my tongue and now I've forgotten it. They also tend to have poor boundaries. That's another thing that the father impresses upon a girl, is a sense of boundaries and how to protect her value. So knowledge of her value, and then also a respect for her value, so that she has good emotional and sexual boundaries. And a lot of these girls just don't have it because the father's not there.
oh man, you didn't write that Washington Post or Wall Street Journal article about masculine fathers raising high functional women, did you?
I
It
did
was
not.
one of
I
the shockingly good essays from a mainstream media outlet.
I did not, and I'm not familiar with it. I've just done a lot of research into this on my own for my own purposes, and these are the conclusions that I've come to.
Yeah. Well, I'm will defer to your wisdom on it, and you're mirroring a very well written essay from, I can't remember if it was the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. Wall Street Journal: Masculine Dads Raise Confident Daughters.
Can you maybe shoot the link over to Aurini so that I can get a copy of it? I'd like to check it out.
Yeah, I'll
Certainly.
post it into the chat.
Okay, thank you.
It should be there now. It's a very, very good essay and relatively short.
Yeah, I'd love to read it. Thank you.
There we go. It's in the chat.
I got it.
One of the things I've mentioned this before, guys, is that at some point in your life, every man eventually is forced to realize that he becomes the patriarch of the family. Now, for most men, this doesn't happen until your father dies, and you realize at this point that you are now responsible for your mother. For me, it happened a little bit earlier because my parents are divorced, that I recognized I couldn't keep relying on her as a mother. I needed to be her rock. There are too many men looking for that mother figure. Guys, you're adults now. You need to cut the apron strings. You cannot keep looking for a mother. You cannot treat every woman that you manage to seduce, séduire, lead astray, that every woman you manage to seduce into your bed, you can't treat her like a mother that's supposed to take care of you. It's quite the opposite. When you take a woman into your life, you are taking responsibility for her. We need this male strength. Without this male strength, everything falls apart. Everything becomes irresponsibility. And there's a lot of guys out there that are so angry that women aren't being responsible in a masculine manner. No, it's your job to be responsible. It's your job to be the rock. It's your job to keep going even when it hurts. And without the patriarchy, without men being fathers, without that, everything falls apart. And we have so little of that. We have people demanding that women act better. If you want women to act better, be a better man. And tell the woman what the standards are for being in your company. If you want a better society, stop begging for it. We are going to make the better society.
Thank you for saying that. It needs to be said.
And John Steele in the comment section says, growing up fatherless forced me to search out my true identity and transcend him. I'm not sure if that's exactly what happens. I mean, it's entirely possible that he's self-aware enough to be able to tell the truth there. But we are genetically and culturally the descendants of our father, not just in terms of habits and behavior. So if you don't, transcending your father is not something that we are biologically capable of doing, in my opinion, anyways. I think you truly have to reconnect with the father in the archetypal sense, if nothing else.
Yes.
Even if not your literal father. I actually discovered your channel, Davis, I want to say like 6 years ago, thanks to your friend Aaron Clary mentioning Jack Donovan. And after following Jack Donovan a little bit, he had mentioned you at some point, and then I found your channel. If any guy out there has not read Jack Donovan's The Way of Men, and in my opinion, the even better but slightly more difficult book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Gillette and Moore, those are great places to start for guys who don't really have good relationships with their father.
Yeah, I second the second recommendation, King, Magician, Lover. That's a really good book.
I second the first recommendation because I've read The Way of Men myself. I would like to read the second book, so thank you for sharing that.
I'm going to recommend both of them. The Way of Men is excellent advice, and the 4 archetypes of what it means to be a man is something that you do need to understand. I haven't read the second book, but I am familiar with the archetypes.
Can you throw that in the chat as well? Because that's another book.
Yeah, toss me the links for those, and we'll put them into the chat.
Certainly, I will. If you're familiar with the archetypes, you probably understand the premise pretty well. The authors go over the positive and negative versions of both archetypes in both the child and adult forms, and where they come from, and their motivations, and how to maybe move more towards the positive from the negative. And even Jack Donovan, and I'm sure that Matt Forney has his concerns with Jack. We can talk about that maybe off screen. I don't want to say personal things there.
I've been friends with. I met him, known him years ago in real life. I've got my reservations about him, but I think he's a solid guy.
Yeah. Well, one of the shortcomings that you could point out in The Way of Men, after having read King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, is that he more or less neglected the king archetype, the generative son archetype. And it sounds like that's the premise of his next book, A More Complete Beast, which should be coming out soon. So for those of you who like Jack Donovan's writings, that's something to look forward to.
Chris, is it okay with you and everyone else if I expound on my comments regarding transcending my father?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, I actually did read that King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and by transcending him, it was the most concise way of kind of explaining how I was able to find masculinity. And that's kind of what the masculinity that my father would have been in a normal state, helping me find for myself. Now, you said that in a way you cannot transcend your father biologically because he's part of you. That's true, but as the king, warrior, magician, lover theory goes, and I'm getting an echo from somebody.
We all
But
know.
anyway,
Not me, I'm on mute.
anyway, I read that book as well, and that's one of the books that helped me. I would what I say transcend my father, and by that, it's true that your father is a biological component of yourself. Now, for me, I got to see this in real life because I didn't meet my father till I was 21. So it was fascinating when I did actually sit down with him. By then I was a grown man, and see him, and I realized just how much of who I am was biologically predetermined. Things like, not just appearance, but things like mannerisms, the way we talked. Even, he had this really strong interest in history as I do. So that is true. But at the same time, even though you are in one sense anchored to by your genes because of who your father is, you can still transcend that because that's half of your DNA, true. But everybody is still born with a different temperament, that as the king, warrior, magician, lover, as I call those temperaments, those archetypes or temperaments, and each one has a unique set of components. But to become fully actualized, you need to try to take the best of each. And there's a book actually called Mind OS. It was written by a psychiatrist who uses those archetypes, and Carl Jung has written extensively about this as well. And you take the best of each of those archetypes and you try to reach the center, where combining the best and losing the worst. And that's ultimately the journey to becoming a fully actualized human being.
I have some things to say on this. My research into the Indo-European myth, my readings of the Babylonian myths, all of this stuff. Rob Fetters wrote about some of this as well. The striking thing that you find is that when the Indo-European mythology moved north versus when it moved south, the southern Babylonian versions of the Indo-European myth, you had every god was mated with a goddess, and to put it bluntly, he spent all his time sniffing after her pussy. They had no hard theology. They had no hard relationships. The goddess was setting the tune, and the god was simply following her around. Yahweh was the only god that came out of that did not have a consort and stood on his own merit rather than pursuing the feminine. Now, when you follow the Indo-European north and west into Europe, you find quite the opposite. You find the supremacy of the Sky Father. I posted this the other day on Twitter. I got a little bit of flack from some people. Dies Pater, Dies Peter, Ius Pater, Jupiter, Dios, Deus, Zeus, Deus, Dagodeus, Tiwaz, and Tyr. And how much does that resemble? Especially the oldest. Dies Pater, Pater Deus Noster. We need the Father God. And I think that's what you're getting at, Steele, is when there's a good post by Quintus Curtius about don't be upset with your historical your heroes of history for being but men that made mistakes. We all reach that period where one day we beat our father at chess. We realize that he is but a man and he is flawed. We need the Father God, every single one of us. And this is why I said this is a spiritual struggle. This needs men of faith.
Well, this harkens back to the conversation we had after my show last night. Unfortunately, we didn't capture it on tape because it was an organic thing and it just came up. Where one of the things I was describing that seems to be different about, paganism, my spiritual beliefs, and what I see in a lot of Christians. And to use your word, the way you defined it is you say Christians kind of compartmentalize their religious or spiritual beliefs. While, the the way it works for me, and I don't want to speak for other pagans, because part of kind of being a pagan, or embracing Indo-European mythology, is you don't proselytize, because it's part of your identity, what you are. It's not simply what you believe in.
All right, to revisit this. This is the critique I have of the effeminacy in the church. That yes, many Christians compartmentalize things. Yeah, I've brought up this whole issue with the 2276 in the Catechism. I've brought this up with a few Christians, and now my priest, he is dealing with it. He just didn't want to make a judgment right away. Of course, he doesn't want to make a snap judgment. I don't blame him for that. Most of them just look the other way. Most of them, I mean, how often do you see people going to confession in Catholic Church? Okay, almost never. And again, I'm not worrying about the splint in somebody else's eye while there's a beam in my own. But there are people I know should be going to confession, and they don't, because it's all compartmentalized. They don't look at the implications of any of this. They're not living the whole truth of it. And this is just rampant in modern society. It's not just Christianity. Okay, how many people do you know that behind closed doors will make jokes about other races, but then out in public are more than happy to vote for the diversity candidate?
Yeah. Something I briefly wanted to comment on what John said. John, if I get you, and I think if we're talking the same thing here, basically what a lot of pagans do, particularly in the Germanic forms of paganism, is they live their mythology. They live a myth. The whole idea of becoming the hero is very much a living mythology. At least
There's
it
a
is.
video I'm working on titled that the European man needs to be a hero. We need to be Beowulf. And right now, again, I've talked to the bicameral mind. One half of us is dressing up like frickin' Klingons and going to these Star Trek conventions. The other half of us is turning into a little newt like Thunderfoot with no mythology whatsoever. And the European man, you need to be a real person, but you also, the only way you can be a European man is by living mythology and being a hero.
Exactly. And the pagans I respect the most who aren't, because you're absolutely right, Davis, it's not just Christians who are succumbing to insincerity in their faith. Most pagans, as I understand it, I haven't hung out in a great number of pagan circles, but from my understanding, most heathen or asatru groups out there are even more cucked than the average Christian congregation these days. But there are, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, as a member of the heathen community, I can speak to that directly.
Mhm.
Yes, your observation is correct. We call them LARPers in many
Right.
cases. They play Viking, and they talk about doing Viking stuff until it's time to do Viking stuff, and then they don't show up.
Right. But I was privileged enough, and I have no idea how I managed to do this, but I was had the privilege of attending an initiation ceremony for one of Paul Wagner and the Wolves of Vinland, one of their new members. And at no point in any of that ritual did they mention the word Viking.
Right.
They weren't doing anything of that sort. Now, they were all very well read in the history of their spirituality, I suppose, because it's not even the history of their religion. They've sort of moved on to their own religion, but it's very deeply informed by the religious tradition of Nordic paganism.
Well, when I say Viking and I use it in that way, I'm being facetious. I mean,
sure.
No serious heathen calls themselves Viking. It was actually a verb anyway. To go a Viking was to go raiding.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It's actually a verb, not a noun.
Okay. Well, they mock the people who will put Thorson, Odin shield or whatever as their Facebook name and their profile pictures are just nothing but Instagram or random internet art of Vikings and Fenris and so
Right.
on and so forth.
They're LARPing. Yeah.
But I think Aurini is right. The authentic, and not just pagan, but the classical Western Christian as well, lives it out. And there are some interesting and visible cases of that from both sides. I would say that the guy who wrote the foreword to my book, Augustus Invictus, has done has really put his neck on the line in a heroic fashion. And I would say there are some Christians out there who are doing that in a similar way.
I think we need to have more conversations between the serious Christians who live their mythology and the serious heathens who live their mythology, because ultimately we're both Indo-Europeans.
Where there is a contradiction between faith and reason, one or both are at fault. It was Aquinas that pointed that out. One of the things that drives me, that frustrates me, I should say, about the, how to put it, those Christians that choose to blind themselves and follow what they think are the dictates of their religion. The dictates of Christianity are to be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents. This does not mean blinding yourself. This does not mean doing precisely what the church tells you without thinking about it. That's what Islam commands. It is, it's like that old song, even if you choose not to choose, you still have made a choice. We are called upon to be wise. And to put it frankly, you don't become wise without making a few mistakes along the way. You know, the old Catholic Church was not afraid of calling many of the pagans virtuous. There is Virgil. Virgil was considered a virtuous pagan. He was so virtuous, the Christian church looked at him and said, there's no way that this guy's in hell. This guy's a virtuous pagan. Same thing for Cicero. Same thing for many, many others. Fear of knowledge does not lead to erudition, does not lead to godliness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And one of the most depressing spirits I feel is creeping through our society is this fear of knowledge. I don't even want to explore this topic because the conclusions I might arrive at, or even might momentarily entertain, will put me in jeopardy. Better leave that alone. Better not be too curious.
You nailed it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It's not just within the church. Okay, there's meant like the church. If the church plays go along to get along, everybody's made in the image of God. Everybody, we can't be prejudiced against immigrants. We can't. That is how the church dies. That bishop that's saying he would be happy if all of the churches in Italy were turned into mosques to make the Muslims feel more comfortable. That is how the truth dies. And it's no different from the people that the moment you bring up the bell curve, the moment you bring up evolution, who see that and say, I can't watch that video, I can't read that book because I might become racist. And it's more important to me that I be nice. It's more important that I get along. It's more important that I be obsequious.
Yeah, that exactly. That's it's one of the things that has irritated me most about Sam Harris recently. I still listen to him from time to time. Is he has occasionally taken this habit of questioning why someone would take an interest in a particular field. I think he asked that of Charles Murray. Why would you even, what would even drive you to this subject of demographics in the first place?
It's called intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
I actually started reading up on the Indo-European mythos, not because I'm friends with Haythrun, but because I was trying to research the cult of the bull that seems to be very extant in Hollywood.
Right. And it always irritated me. And for a while, my de facto response to that was, well, you never know what results may come of this. Perhaps the research into the nature of the biology of race, for example, would put an end to racism. That's an entirely possible outcome. It's supposedly likely from what I hear in academia, although we're not allowed to find out.
Dawkins wrote a very beautiful book called The Ancestor's Tale, where he likens it to the Canterbury Tales. He based it upon that. And what he did is he wrote a history of evolution. In the Canterbury Tales, each chapter follows a different character in this journey. And so for his version, he wrote each stage of evolution that led up to us humans, and is an absolutely beautiful and poetic book. Okay, Dawkins has his flaws. He has many flaws, but this book was absolutely beautiful. I'm reading a book about science and actually teared up at the eyes at a few parts. And there's this one bit, I remember this with such great irony, where Dawkins was writing about how humans are so very, very good at distinguishing race. He took a picture of Bush and the Condoleezza Rice and the other black guy that was in his administration. And he said, like, we look at that and we can immediately tell. Colin Powell, thank you. And he said, we immediately know that one of them's white and two of them are black. But then he said, imagine you're an alien and just take a triangle from each of their forehead. That skin color, there's almost no difference there. So it's like we're programmed to recognize race. And then he commented, we are so lucky that when we split from chimpanzees, we are so lucky that all of those proto-humans went extinct. We are so lucky that the only extant humans are all genetically equal.
Genetically equal in long distance running, I assume he meant, right?
Well, he said it with genuine belief. And he commented that how terrible would it be if there were substantive differences between the races? If we had Cro-Magnons wandering around, if we had the etc. These things that are like halfway human, some of them bury their dead, but they clearly don't have language.
I have some bad news for Mr. Dawkins. Science, very recent science, has finally confirmed that there are, in fact, substantial differences between men and women. I don't know how we will deal with this. I don't know how we will I don't know how we will. It's a terrible, horrible fact, and I don't know how we'll get over it. But it's something we're going to have to deal with somehow.
Life would be much easier if there were no differences. Quite frankly, I would be very happy. You know what? If some science came out tomorrow proving that there is no substantive genetic difference between people, it's all environment. I guess those East Africans, they just like running a lot. I would actually be very happy if that came out, because that would make life a lot simpler, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. I would be happy if somebody could show to me that the Pope was just being quoted out of context and the guy's not a heretic. That would make me absolutely ecstatic.
Yeah, not to be too, debating for debate's sake, but I think the complexity and the conflict in many ways makes life more fun too. You can look at it, I suppose, in either way, but I suppose I enjoy the conflict and the debate a great deal, and the complexity and constantly having to learn new things and sort out and reject old views. It makes life a challenge.
Yeah, it's like intellectual weightlifting, and you get you get stronger by doing it.
It's kind of being on the journey too. Don't you agree that
the heroes?
The hero's journey. That's a constant theme throughout the Indo-European mythos.
Absolutely, and well put. There would be no men. There would be no heroic men if there wasn't a need for heroism.
That's right. And I think that we need that as Europeans, because Europeans have this unique quality, at least I think it's unique, to strive, to really strive for some type of ideal. They've always been the explorers, both physically, mentally, spiritually, seeking after some ideal.
Yes, that's so true that you said that. I'm glad you brought that up. That harkens back to something I had said once before, I believe in one of David's streams about if you look at, the great explorers, from Shackleton to Columbus to, or just the whole idea of how Indo-Europeans came to dominate all of Europe. They stretched out in all directions, starting in the Caucasus and went north, east, west, south. I think there's something true about that, and that's part of our identity.
By the way, we got a super chat from Dashing Rogue where he points out that Dawkins also said there are benefits to cannibalism.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well,
I do recommend that book, The Ancestor's Tale. It's very beautiful and very informative.
Hey,
But yeah, I agree with what there is this yearning in the European soul for exploration, this romanticism. Just imagine being there with your horse and your rifle and your loyal hound and going off into the wilderness, home on the range.
yeah, and just not to sound too preemptively defensive, but this is not to even to say that Europeans are therefore better than any other group, because there's no metric that you could use to compare the two, that we just are this way. I was talking to a very intelligent Chinese friend of mine, and I was asking him why in Chinese history was there not a warrior aristocracy as there was in European history. And he said, well, Chris, what you have to understand is that the Chinese invented crossbows 2,500 years ago. And with a crossbow, an untrained peasant could take down a warrior with 20 years of training. So the warriors no longer were needed, really, for the retention of political power. And so they developed these bureaucracies. And Chinese societies make marvelous and very effective bureaucracies. Us Europeans are not as good at that.
We Westerners have only recently figured out through mathematics what the Asians have known in Zen Buddhism and Taoism for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and that's not to say that the Chinese are better than us. We're just we are different, and there's fascinating things to learn from both. But we have to pay attention to what we are, what our own nature is, if we want to live the best life that we can.
Right.
I've said before that the human races are more distinct from one another than the aliens on Star Trek are. Because at the end of the day, the Star Trek aliens are basically just following different philosophies, right? The Ferengi are a little bit greedy, and the Klingons are a little bit douchebaggy. But the human races, there's this absolutely amazing diversity. I'll tell you, one of the things that I'm most proud of with the European race is that we did not genocide the Native Americans. We could have. 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, we probably would have. And yet we didn't. We didn't treat them as well as maybe we should have. But we did not genocide them. And their wisdom is still extant upon the earth for us. There is so much knowledge you can get from encountering a people different from your own. And we have this rich tapestry of humanity, and the monsters on the left that call us Nazis want to eradicate it.
Well, they don't understand what folkism is, right? I identify as a folkish heathen, and folkism is the preservation and celebration of one's own people and culture, and a respect also for the same in other cultures. I want every culture on this planet to be preserved and celebrated and sustained and furthered. But it's when we start to corrupt that. Multiculturalism tends to have a corrupting effect, whereas when we have these homogenous societies, we can retain. You know what I'm saying?
And then we can truly visit and share.
Right. We can exchange ideas, we can trade while still maintaining those boundaries that keep our culture intact.
Davis, you brought up an interesting point about how we were less cruel to the Native Americans than the historical precedent would have left a theorist to imagine, we could say.
Well, and let's keep in mind that the Native Americans genocided the race that inhabited North America prior to their arrival.
Oh, certainly, but we could have wiped them out, but didn't, was the point that I thought you were making. And this is entirely speculative. This is just a off-the-cuff hypothesis that occurred to me now. But the way that we killed the majority of them was not intentional. It was through disease. And the reason that that disease killed the Native Americans and not our Anglican and German ancestors was because we had already been through that a few years before with the Black Death and with a variety of other diseases that festered and bred in cities and urban areas. And I wonder how much of the compassion we evidently had for them had to do with familiarity with the suffering of disease. This is just a speculative hypothesis, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that possibility.
My old history prof wrote a book strongly arguing that, yeah, it was what took over North America was not malicious intent. It was, first of all, something like 90% of Native Americans died completely unintentionally through disease, leaving all of this land that was, imagine a game of Civ 5 where a bunch of cities get destroyed, but all the farmers' fields are still all prepared there. It's very easy to settle those lands. Second of all, because it was primarily Britain that took over North America, Britain being a small island had developed the most advanced form of property law ever seen on the planet. British property law demands that the land be put to use. So in Britain, if you had a lord that had inherited some land, but he was leaving the land fallow because he was getting drunk in Paris, and some dirty peasant started a farm on that land, you would get squatter's rights for the peasant because he is making use of the land. And that, plus the financial speculation, create this huge expanse westward. In fact, the British authorities did not want to expand westward because this requires more expenditure on troops to keep the people safe whenever people move westward. But this advanced property law, so you get the depopulation plus this advanced property law that just screams the land must be used productively, creates this westward explosion, despite the fact that the authorities actually didn't want to do that during the settlement of North America. For the British Crown, it was a pain in the ass having to expand westward. But the land speculators, the homesteaders, it demanded that.
I'm trying to recall, there was a discussion between Jordan Peterson and somebody, I can't remember, but they brought up that very question of who has the rights to a piece of property in an instance like that, where somebody owns the property, but they've allowed it to just fall into disrepair and it's all overgrown. And then somebody comes in and transforms it into a beautiful garden, mixes their labor with the land and cultivates from that something of beauty, something of value. Does the property owner actually own it, or does the person who applied his labor and made something beautiful and useful out of it own it? And I mean, I would be in agreement with the English on that, And
the goal of the English was, again, it's such a tiny little island. If the English did not make the best use of their land, then they couldn't sustain a population. The population of Britain is larger than the population of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
That is mind-blowing.
It's amazing how much waste we have in the modern day. You take a look at a typical suburban neighborhood, and we have these huge sprawling lawns, and it's really nothing more than a vanity. That land isn't being used for gardening or raising animals or anything. It's just there. It's there to mow.
Well,
mow it there.
someone actually said on Twitter, sorry to interrupt, but that lawns are now an expression of white racism.
I think they're just an expression of vanity, really.
I think you're absolutely correct. I just finished Bill Bryson's book on home a couple weeks ago, and he was going through the origins of lawns, and what lawns were an expression of the English aristocracy, of all the land that they didn't need to cultivate food on. They were wealthy enough to expend an extraordinary amount of money at a time where there weren't lawnmowers, having workers cut these things with scythes to remarkably straight levels. I mean, it's hard to get a nice lawnmower level cut without a lawnmower.
And now
Yeah.
is the degenerate bourgeoisie trying to imitate the wealth of the nobility. In this case, it's like I've always despised front lawns. One of the things I really love about Vegas is that because grass just dies there, you have rock gardens. Back in Ontario, I used to really admire people. Some people, instead of having a front lawn, would grow heather and other types of non-labor intensive plants on the front line. It was very beautiful. I admire those because it's such a, oh goodness, what's an equivalent? Like you know when the lower middle class people start affecting something that used to be very expensive and it just looks trashy, like a cubic zirconium or something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that happens with names a lot.
Yes, Brittany. You know, Brittany starts off as an upper class name, and then the lower class starts adopting the name Brittany to sound upper class, and so it's no longer an upper class name. By the way, a super chat of $10 from EC2189 Kaku. Euro-American history is riddled with beautiful accidents and tragedies. The further expansion, the freer and more independent the operation. Native used guns on each other before pointing them at the settlers. Yeah, like this narrative that evil Europeans stole the land from the noble savages is, listen, there are amazing things. Like this is really blows me away. It's people that are actually interested in political history look at the, what do they call it? The Six Nations, the Seven Nations, that without a system of writing, the Native Americans in the, like near the Great Lakes, actually formed a coalition government. That is mind-blowing. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it was a major inspiration for the founders of the American Republic.
Well,
Okay.
and they also did one of the greatest acts of genetic engineering in history by domesticating corn. The nearest genetic relative to corn is a species of grass that looks nothing like corn, or maize as it's known among the natives. And corn actually cannot survive in the wild on its own. It has to be cultivated that way in order to stay around. And the fact that they did that, as great of feats in genetic engineering as what the Europeans did with dogs and sheep and cows and aurochs and other things, that's quite an accomplishment as well.
And you know, I know Jared Diamond gets a lot of flack, and rightly so, I have to say. He says, maybe we should have a discipline called history. Yeah, it exists, you idiot. But he does make an excellent point about biota, that the maize of North America, with Indo-Europe, Eurasia, when you domesticate something in one place, it very quickly spreads east and west, because you get similar climatic conditions the whole way. Whereas with North America, because there's primarily a north-south alignment, you can domesticate maize here, and you can just domesticate the alpaca down there, but it doesn't spread. So was it the alpaca? Anyway, one of those weird North American herd beasts. One of the reasons that the Incan Empire, thank God, did not spread very far is because they did not have pack animals. Down in Peru, they had domesticated a pack animal that would have been perfect for the Incans, or sorry, for the Aztecs. The Incans domesticated it, the Aztecs didn't have it. It would have been perfect for the Aztecs, but in between the two regions was this vast gulf of tropical climate where the animal could not survive. And so Jared Diamond is correct about that. The north-south axes of North America did inhibit the social development of the native peoples. And we got another super chat for 17.76 . And oh wait, do we have more? No, I think that's brothers and sisters, we are gathered in conscience. Hey guys, I as a black man feel good about what you say, yet I feel weirded out and isolated by the Euro talk. Listen to you sporadically for years. Yeah, no, I haven't said much about the blacks on this stream, but listen. I think everybody can agree that the blacks are the coolest race. I find the black race very refreshing. They are a very unpretentious race. Let me share you a story. I'm going to share this story, not to brag about myself, but because I think I was talking to somebody about charity and this conspicuous charity. I really despise it. I don't like conspicuous charity. One time I was coming out of the food store in Nashville, and this man approached me, an older white man, and he said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm very hungry. Do you have anything you can share with me?" And now, listen, guys, I was not in a good financial state at the time, but like this guy was hungry. He wasn't asking for money. He was asking for food. I'm like, listen, I can give you here's a tin of meat. I can give you some bananas. I can give you something, right? I wish I could give you more, but I can give you something. And I gave it to him, and he said, "Thank you," and he wandered off. Right after that, a little old black lady walked up to me and said, "Sir, I saw what you did. God bless you."
I'm the one you shared that story with.
Black women seem to be the most divisive demographic in the United States, from my experience. They are either irredeemably obnoxious or the wisest and kindest people you will ever meet. No,
That's a fair observation. Yeah.
If you were in a philosophical mood, I suppose you could argue that blacks are in many ways the most Nietzschean race out there in terms of their intuitive nature. But the thing, and I understand why a black American might be a little weirded out by Euro talk. But the point is that I think if all of us were black for some reason, I don't think any of our politics would be any different. You know, the cultures we would be looking back to would be very different. You know, we would be reading about Anansi and the trickster spider and things of that nature, and Shaka Zulu. But I'm
actually playing a Civ game as Shaka Zulu right now. He gets
excellent
combat bonuses.
But the care about connection with who you are and with your people and with your inner nature is a universal thing. Now, every group is going to have a different manifestation of it. And I would wish the same thing for blacks and black Americans who are different than African blacks, as I would for my own children. Not to the same degree, because we obviously have obligations to family first. But in the abstract sense, I would hope that everyone would get that same sense of connection with their history and their culture and their identity.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what folkism is. You know, that's what I was talking about a little bit earlier, preserving everyone's unique culture.
One of the things I've said, what really infuriates me about the democratic story sold to the black underclass, who've been turned into an underclass, is the lack of heroism in black history. There is so much heroism there. My primary, I don't know if I could call him a musical inspiration. Well, yeah, I could. Actually, I could. Is John Coltrane. I absolutely love that man's music. I am not a fan of Miles Davis, even though I'm pretty sure I was named after him. I absolutely love Coltrane. I've taught myself to play several of his solos. I have a whole book of his solos of giant steps. Like, it's nothing but giant steps in every single solo ever recorded. There is a great deal of heroism in black history, which is erased and denied. And quite frankly, when we look at the contemporary events, the Pizzagate, the Hollywood and whatnot, some of the people that are really coming up to the forefront and standing up for the truth are blacks. A lot of people are being frank and open about what's involved with the rap game. And just like, we have a couple more super chats. I need to get to these. Gregory W. Trump SS says, if your goal was to become the most extreme cringe LARP ever to defame a politician at a political rally, would you dress up as a QAnon supporter? All right, I'll say this about QAnon.
Obviously.
I will say this, that I do think there is something there, but I'm very trust the plan and implicit do nothing very much worries me. I think Trump is doing very good things. I think we need to be taking advantage of this opportunity to start networking, start forming communities. We've got Jet Li for Life, 5164. He says, oh no, sir, I did not mean it in the negative. Did I miss an earlier super chat from him?
He was mentioning how the European talk weirded him out a little bit and isolated him. And we were talking about how, look, you know, the true connectivity doesn't come across racial, cultural, ethnic, and religious boundaries, although we're having a bit of a spiritual ecumenical talk here. But it comes from connecting with your inner nature, and that applies to whites and to blacks alike. And so he was coming back and saying, oh, I didn't mean that in the negative. So
okay, glad to hear it. Because again, this is the one reason I can't get on board with the white nationalists is this pipe dream of if America were completely white. And you know what? Maybe you can argue that it would have been a very good idea not to import slaves. Well, they did, and that's our history. Where do we go from here? EC2189 Kaku sends US $5, says, yes, Davis, blacks are still cool. To the super chat, gentlemen. West Indian folk claiming they invented hip hop when it's a black American invention. And so is jazz. Okay, rock and roll and jazz directly stem from the African rhythm. Listen, Europeans did amazing things with music, but we always did the 1-2 beat. The blacks put the emphasis on the second beat, and a whole new genre of music developed in North America because of this African rhythm.
Yeah, don't forget blues, folk, or not folk, funk, soul, all of that.
The major division between country and rock and roll, like they're both, typically these days, they're white forms of music, but country follows the original 1-2, 1-2 with the emphasis on the one, whereas rock follows 1-2, 1-2 with the emphasis on the second beat. There's some musical history for you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, a friend of mine, actually a white nationalist friend of mine, Greg Johnson, recently found an article on, they've apparently discovered what ancient Greek music more or less sounded like and recreated it. I posted the link in the group chat here.
Send me this link. This is, guys, we have no record of what music looked like before 1600 or so.
I posted it in the Hangouts group chat. It's not letting me post it in the message chat.
There's a video that I posted. I was searching for this while you were talking when you were talking about the Native Americans where we could have slaughtered them. And there's an interesting clip I posted in there. I'd like you to take a look at when you get a chance.
Regarding the music, they used a completely different scale. The ancient modal scale is different from the major minor scale that came into being. Yeah, I guess would be around the 15 or 1600s. And there was also different frequencies that were used for the tuning. Like we now tune middle A to it's 440 hertz, but it used to be 432, which is supposed to be in harmony with the universe, whereas 440 is not. It's actually dissonant.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's a major question I've had for a long time about whether or not the placing of the tuning is arbitrary or meaningful.
Oh, it is meaningful. And if that's something that you're interested in, I would encourage anybody to just Google 432 hertz versus 440 hertz. And you'll find some very interesting information out there on that.
Don't expect me to speak because I'm typing this into a search bar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I
As
think
I've often told Aurini, I don't like to give people knowledge. I like to point where the knowledge is and let them discover it for themselves.
well, then they value it more. It's kind of,
Exactly. They turn over the stone and they find it for themselves.
but that what you're talking about is the 432 hertz. You're saying is more in harmony with nature. That's kind of harkens back to earlier we were talking about the importance of connecting with our past. Not to overindulge in it, but to connect. There's wisdom in the ancients.
Absolutely.
Well, and here's a research project for any linguists or psychologists who might be listening. You can do some data searches on the most prevalent phonemes and sounds in particular languages and see if you can find any correlations between music styles and the sounds of the languages that produce them. I feel like that could be an interesting research project.
Yeah, very much so. I can see that. Something else that you will discover when you start looking into the 432 hertz tuning is that all of the pitches in the scale numerologically reduce to either 3, 6, or 9. And
Which you just linked me to a video that was quite fascinating.
oh, you watched that about the number 9?
Yes, here we go. Here's the link. I'm tossing it down into the chat for you folks.
We could do a whole show on that.
Yeah, I'm really wondering what happens when you put it into something other than base 10.
Yeah.
Because
they're sacred numbers is what they are. And the ancients knew that these numbers were sacred.
Well, this is one of these things that it must come from intuition rather than from, because there's no way that the ancients, when they were coming up with the 360-degree Babylonian scale, understood this. One of the things the moderns have tried to do is change from the 360 degrees to a 1600 mil system. This is what the military uses, and I don't like it. I like 360 degrees. And there seems to be something a little bit existential about this number. And so this has me wondering, if you switch to a base 8 numbering system or a base 13 numbering system, would you still be finding these patterns? I don't have the answer to that. I may work through the math.
I was going to say, maybe you should run that experiment and see what you find.
Well, the only reason we have a base 10 number system is because we have 10 fingers.
Well, it actually might not be that. This video about the number 9 that I just linked, guys, one of the things that comes up is the Fibonacci sequence. And if you take 2 layers of the Fibonacci sequence, you find a mirroring of 3s, 6s, and 9s. And it's an infinite all the way through the Fibonacci sequence. 3s, 6s, and 9s just keep occurring. Like, this is not just, here's an interesting artifact of the base 10 numbering system. This is, good Lord, why the hell is there this much correspondence? Like, this is...
So, something else that I would challenge anybody here to do if they're curious, and you can go on YouTube and Google this, there's plenty of samples, is listen to a piece of music played in 432 hertz tuning, and then listen to the same piece of music played in 440, and tell me which one resonates with you more.
Is there a video where we can do that?
Yeah, just Google it on YouTube. There's a lot of people who have actually recorded it on a guitar or violin or something like that. But just compare them and just see what you resonate more with as an organic being.
Interesting.
$5 super chat from Jet Li for Life 5164 says, I first learned of you 10 years ago, Davis, in my conspiracy days. Yeah, this, speaking of conspiracies briefly, for some reason this came up. Red State magazine, which is a major conservative source. Did you know that about 5 years ago, they wrote an article accusing me, and also Bernard Chapin, I believe, but they accused me of being a conspiracy theorist because I wrote an article referencing the fact that the 94 World Trade Center bombing was a setup by the FBI who gave the guy real explosives but false detonators. And, like, guys, it's mainstream history. It's reported by the New York Times. All right, I referenced this and got called a conspiracy theorist by those scumbags at Red State. And they also, I believe, intentionally misspelt my name so that I wouldn't notice. Oh, they are scum. I think I wrote something about it. I don't care about Red State. And we got a super chat from EC2189 Kaku. Journey and discovery is a lost experience in our postmodern world. It's reduced to a repugnant corporate excursion, paved asphalt pathways, fearing inquiry because risk of alienating from the group. Yeah, people are so afraid to stand out. There's a great video by the Alternative Hypothesis asking if Minecraft was the symptom of a dying society, because this is the only place young boys can go to explore.
Yeah, and going back to the conspiracy theory thing for a moment, one of the amusing things about the claim that someone is a conspiracy theorist is that the term is, when you actually think about it, is enormously broad. So many theories qualify as conspiratorial in the technical sense that the argument is essentially unfalsifiable, which is the reason why conspiracy theories are generally dismissed, ironically enough, is that they cannot be falsified or disproven. They're just wild claims that, you know, we could go on for years coming up with. But, you know, claiming that someone is a conspiracy theorist rather than saying, oh, they made X claim and it's false because of Y reason. You know, the former is just so much easier, and it sounds so much more salacious than the latter.
And it's intellectually lazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
just one more thing on
do.
conspiracy theories, just to throw it in there. Anyone who's interested, is there was a documentary produced called it's either The Noble Lie or A Noble Lie regarding Oklahoma City. And it's similar to what David was talking about, the not 9/11, but the World Trade Center bombing that happened. I think it was actually 93 or 92, Davis, when that happened.
I could be wrong about the year.
Well, I lived in New York at the time, so I don't even know. But this is about Oklahoma City, where they actually did have a federal source inside LOM City, which was kind of a Christian identitarian group or whatever. And you can Google Andy the German, I think is what it was, and all of that. But it's quite fascinating, and none of this was really covered. But if you're interested, I believe you can see the whole video on YouTube, A Noble Lie.
You know, one thing I will comment is that there is something to the conspiracy mindset personality, and I've unfortunately run into a lot of these people. And what it boils down to with these guys is that they want to feel like they're smarter than the people that are trying to trick them. And so they will sit around in their garage with their buddy drinking beer and talk about these conspiracies, but they won't do anything with it, right? Like the point of, like they're talking about how the government has, you know, UFOs are visiting the government. Okay, well, what are we going to do about this? What are the UFOs? Are they weather satellites? Are they Russian spy probes? Are they demonic manifestations? Are they visitors from another? What are they? And that's my question about the whole bloody thing.
So the fact that they don't act on it means they have no skin in the game?
Exactly. They want to have a little whispered conversation. You know what? They brought me in for a conference to see what I thought was a patriotic symbol. And I knew that they were doing that. So I took their money, but I gave them false answers. Dude, they were designing a beer commercial and they wanted to go, I am Canadian. What's the best patriotic symbol? That's all it was. So unfortunately, I have met a lot of these people. There are a lot of people that you know, Penn and Teller did a fairly good episode where they talked about how these UFO hunters, really, they just want to hang out with some people and have hot dogs and tell scary stories to one another. And it's very frustrating when you run into these guys because there are actual conspiracies out there. And I think when we talk about them, we're trying to look into them. Dashing Rogue says he just got back from the Berkeley protest. Thank you for your prayers, Davis. And hey, Thrune. Yeah, Dashing Rogue was up to something. I'm not sure exactly what he was up to today, but he managed to survive without getting pepper sprayed or locked in jail. So I'm glad he's still here. And Gregory W. Trump SS sends $2 US. And by the way, Dashing Rogue, we're gonna probably get you on to talk about that next week. Gregory W. Trump SS says, "Is American citizenship worth less than Canadian?" I'm pretty sure.
Well, no.
Yeah.
Well, it depends a great deal on what you mean by worth, right? Which one is more exclusive? Which one gets you more stuff? I think in the long run, I mean, I suppose you could go in a lot of different directions on that, but if your gauge is which one is more meaningful in terms of defining you as a member of the group, it looks to me like, at least for the moment, Canadian citizenship is worth slightly more. Now, with Trudeau in the lead, that might get corrected in the next year or two.
Listen, our Canada has been completely overrun with our equivalent of H-1Bs.
Really? Okay. My understanding was that they still had a ways to go to catch up to the United States, but that they were in the process of making that correction.
You know, I know what the stats say, and I know what I see day to day. And what I see day to day is you go to any fast food restaurant, you go to any gas station, you go to... The only place where I see white people working is at the grocery store for some reason, and none of them are kids. It's all people that are 30, 40, 50 working. You go to any gas station or fast food restaurant, it's Indians and Filipinos working there.
Well, you go to the city of Vancouver, which is not far from where I live. You might as well be in Shanghai.
Yeah, that city has the nickname Hongcouver because Hong Kong Chinese have bought up all the property in it. And there's neighborhoods where you have to speak Cantonese.
Well, similar stuff's going on in Seattle, not terribly far from where I currently live. There are whole neighborhoods that I remarked to some friends looked like suburbs of Cairo or other parts of North Africa or the Middle East, just from the language of the signs and the people walking around in long robes and small hats. So
we also have a massive African immigration. Now, I will say that up until the refugee crisis, they're actually pretty good Africans. Okay, they're not like the refugees are absolute garbage human beings. Okay, it's all men running away from their countries because they couldn't get laid there because they were too big of a loser in Africa to get laid. The ones that we had come to Calgary over the past decade or so are actually high quality church going family men and women. But still, it's a massive, massive demographic change.
Would you consider good Africans to be better or worse than the bad Africans? I think we started talking about the New York Times and their interesting standards for hiring high IQ Asian women with a grudge on their shoulder. But many of these highly intelligent immigrants, particularly the ones from India, at least here in the Northwest, where Indian immigrants are just absolutely have taken over, the tech industry. And they're very functional and they're very, as a group, intelligent. But the fact that they are functioning well doesn't mean that they integrate well in our society.
I know it's actually, in a way, it's worse. I was on Steele's channel I think it was last night. And I was pointing out that what I want is more degeneracy for the left and less degeneracy for us. The worst thing, in my opinion, is when you get functional degeneracy. When everybody's smoking pot, when everybody's having casual sex,
right?
You no longer have the bad examples. If we could reorient politics to help concentrate, you liberals want to smoke pot? You go right ahead. Here's all the pot that you want. We're going to legalize it. Meanwhile, we're going to have a whole bunch of ad campaigns calling potheads loser degenerates. Okay, that would be far, far better than this state of affairs where everybody smokes pot. And if we had a small number of quality immigrants, good Lord, 30 years ago in Canada, if you immigrated here, you were told where you were going to live. because the Canadian government did not want ethnic enclaves. So I have a friend from South Africa. He was told, you are going to live in Calgary for the next 10 years because we don't want you South Africans, even though you're white, we don't want you moving into one neighborhood and speaking that gobbledygook fake English that you speak. We want you acclimatizing and becoming Canadian.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to jump off for a family matter. I'll try to rejoin if I can, okay?
All right. God bless, Hathrin.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, see ya. Good luck with that.
See you later.
So yeah, in a way, it's actually, see, the refugees are, they're blowing up people and murdering kids at cafes and whatnot. Like this is actually nice and straightforward, right? It demonstrates what's going on. Whereas the good quality ones, it's as individuals, of course, I prefer them. As a demographic shift, it is terrifying. And by the way, $2 from EC2189 Kaku. The tinfoil cap can produce crazy a historicist mindset. They tend to cower away from academic methodology or basic epistemology in which these theories warrant such objectification. Dude, one of the guys claimed that faster than light travel was possible because he once was driving across Australia and it took him 3 hours to do a 12-hour journey. And like, this is really autistic, but I got all upset because I'm like, buddy, even if I take that at face value, that doesn't prove faster than light travel. No epistemology to these people.
Yeah. The comment you were making about South African immigrants being divided among the city was an interesting one. My wife was telling me, based on what she's read, that not terribly long ago in the United States history, immigrants were not just told where to live and prevented from forming ethnic enclaves, but inspectors would come around and made sure that they were eating mashed potatoes and gravy and roast beef, not whatever ethnic food they had been used to eating, and that they were setting the table in the American fashion. The integration was really, really thorough. And the concern about ethnic enclaves is not even relegated to the modern age. Back in the 1750s, I want to say, Ben Franklin was extremely concerned that Germans would not integrate with Anglican society, which the United States was forming around an English culture. He said they won't acclimate, they'll never truly become Americans. And many Americans are inclined to think, well, that's clearly wrong. What a hilariously sort of backwards opinion to have. But interestingly enough, to this day, particularly in Pennsylvania, there are populations of German, Dutch or German people who don't speak English. They speak German, and who fundamentally don't understand the rights of Englishmen and the Constitution and Bill of Rights based around it that our civic culture has been built on.
It was actually Benjamin Franklin who wrote about that.
I'm sorry, did I say someone other than Ben Franklin?
No, I don't think you said any name, but it was.
Oh, okay. I meant to say Ben Franklin, yes.
Yeah.
It's as if dad says to his kids, you know what? You can't trust just any dog because they might be dangerous. And he cautiously approaches a dog, and the dog turns out to be okay. So the kids decide that all dogs are safe. The Germans and Polacks and Italians more or less integrated. They certainly did shift the culture of America quite a bit, but they integrated quite well overall, all things considered. Nobody in my family speaks Italian since we came here. All right. My great grandfather was the last one to speak Italian. We all learned English. But that doesn't mean the caution was not due in the first place. And today, I'm sitting at Starbucks, and these three kids walk out babbling at one another in Korean. And they were not tourists.
Yeah, it's definitely, the demographics are definitely shifting, and to the people who think that race is only skin deep and it really doesn't matter and it's all cultural, even if you presume that that's all true, the basic social trust built on simply looking like other people around you is quantifiable and scientifically rather well attested to. That alone would be enough to warrant, you know,
Even if
ethnic homogeneity, and it would apply to having similar haircuts and dressing similarly too, of course, which is also part of having a shared culture.
even if it was 100% cultural and 0% genetic, which it's not. That's not what the evidence points to anyway. Even if it was that, the fact of the matter is that we are not inducting these people into our culture. We have so many. Part of the issue is that Europeans tend to be extremely empathic. And you can, HBD Chick has written quite a bit about this. It goes back to traditions of cousin marriage and what have you, that we learn to empathize with our neighbors very well. And the way that we bred with one another, instead of creating the very strong patrilineal lines that you get in the Middle East, create a very diffused sort of genetic basis. And so even though the city on the other side of the hill they spoke a different accent from you, had a slightly different culture, you were actually very mixed with them genetically. So we are very, very empathic towards others. And that is not necessarily the case with all other races, not to the same degree as us. And so we want to imagine that we can blend with no problems, that people are moving to North America to become North Americans. And in some cases they are, but in many cases, they are moving here to be an X that lives in North America. And you know what? I'd actually like to see more talk from the Black community about new African immigrants, because the Blacks that live in America have earned their place in America. They've been there for centuries. They've got a blood claim to the soil. And
Right.
I think if you talk to them, they'll point out that these new African immigrants, just because they're my skin color does not mean that they're my people.
There was a great presentation for American Renaissance back in 2014, I want to say. It was given by a Comanche chief. I forget his name, but he described the frustration of being a warrior culture at war with another warrior culture. And he said something to the effect of, warrior cultures respect strength. So we fight you for 400 years, and we fought hard. We fought for our life, and you guys fought hard, and eventually, finally, after centuries of conflict, you guys won. Okay, fair enough. But you're letting us live here. We're a conquered people, but there was 400 years of serious conflict, and you guys earned that with blood in the soil. But now you're giving what you conquered to these other people for nothing.
Yeah,
it's like, we won't let this happen. This is an insult to the 400 years of conflict that we shared together.
It's one thing when you're conquered by a badass, but when you're conquered by a bunch of SJW purple-haired balloon animals. And by the way, Jet Li for Life 5164 says, "Oh, fucking thank you." I guess that made sense. I'm glad it did. Yeah, it's... What the hell happened to us that we abandoned our warrior roots? What the hell happened to us that we're a generation playing video games and playing video games and reading comic books? And how many of us have been in a damn fist fight? You get into a fist fight these days, you go to prison. That's not white culture.
Well, not to sound maybe contradictory, and this is a little devil's advocate with my own position, but Dr. Kevin McDonald gave a presentation a year or so back on the origins of white people. And he talked about the blending of the indigenous European people with the Semitic farmers further south with the Indo-European peoples who rode in. And the dominant Indo-European culture was a very warlike culture. But one of the things about warrior cultures, he said, was that they're very meritocratic. They're not very ethnocentric. They're not very tribalistic as a group. You would expect it not to be the case. But in a warrior culture, you need people who you can trust to fight. You need the best people to fight. So
Well,
meritocracy wins out over family.
And just an interesting, have you noticed that the blending of whites and Amerindians, there's, like, it tends to go without real notice, right? Like, people have to go out of their way to point out, well, I'm 1/16 Native American, or I'm, like, it's always struck me the Native American whites actually blended pretty well, and given the, this is complete speculation, but
So
there does seem to be quite a bit of the warrior culture.
you're hitting on Robert Piercing's hypothesis. I think it was in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, but Robert Piercing suggested that perhaps American culture is the product of the blending of European aristocratic ideals with the Native American nobility. The strong and silent cowboy archetype, that's more Native American than it is European. Europeans never valued the strong, silent.
Hearing that little whistle in the background while the red man stares at the eagle. Do, 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 do.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, an interesting historical fact, Thomas Jefferson's son-in-law was part Native American and took great pride in it. And I believe he had 8 children with Jefferson's daughter. And Jefferson found this, commented on this, how someone who was part Native American was kind of deemed with a little bit of awe, while if you were part African, you weren't.
Yeah, I'm more or less with Davis Aurini on the point that he brought up earlier, which is that, you know, if you want to ask what's a racial American, the question almost doesn't make sense. But ethnically speaking, I think you could say, honestly, an ethnic American would include Anglican and German whites, but would also include Native Americans and the descendants of Black slaves, specifically. I don't know if there's any way around that.
We got a super chat from EC2189 Kaku, who comments that Jeet Kune Do is an American warrior philosophy. And listen, go back to the history of Canada for a moment. Canada did not used to be the country of free healthcare and socialism and nicety. Canada used to be the country. The way we achieved independence was that we are polite because you have to be polite in the frozen north, otherwise you die. And we would sit around and we would, you know, build our moose lodges and whatnot. And then wait, Britain's getting into a war? My regiment actually started up because we heard there was a war happening in South Africa. Nobody in Canada knew what the hell South Africa was. We didn't know who the Boers were. We didn't care. A bunch of private businessmen raised money to create a regiment so we could go down to South Africa and kill people because Canadians like killing people, and we are very, very good at it.
Doesn't a Canadian still hold the record for long distance sniper kill?
I believe we do.
Actually, that happened in Afghanistan. This is an interesting, a true story that you brought that up. I know a little bit about this. It happened in Afghanistan, but with a 50 caliber round, and it was done by a Canadian sniper who was on loan to a special forces unit. But he did it with American ammo. The Canadian ammo didn't work. Well, and the reason, I'm not kidding. I saw a documentary on this, and the reason it is the longest sniper shot is it took place at extreme altitude, so the air was very thin.
So the moral of the story is to buy American but hire Canadian.
Yes.
Well, let me tell you something. When this,
I saw an interview with the sniper, and he was talking about that the Canadian ammo, wasn't making it, and then he switched to the American 50 caliber round, and that's what he got the kill shot with. It was longest confirmed kill.
Well, here's the thing. Listen, I had my copy of Soldier of Fortune and whatever the popular Toronto newspaper was at the time. Soldier of Fortune titled the article, "World Record Sniper Shot Performed by Canadian Soldier." The article, which appeared on page 20 of the Canadian newspaper, was titled "Canadian Ammo Falls Short."
That is funny.
So yeah, I've actually got a real chip on my shoulder about this. Yeah, a Canadian sniper, it's the, what was it, 1.8 kilometers or something ridiculous like that, managed to take a guy out. And instead of praising this hero, the Canadian press took a shit on the Canadian military as usual.
Well, it's the polite thing to do, obviously.
So yeah, Canada was, when you see all this, when you see all this, you know, the Mounties dealing with the Native Americans and treating them with respect and whatnot, that's the two warriors coming at each other with respect. The old RCMP used to be these lunatics wearing bright red British uniforms and riding horses around 2 days away from civilization and still showing up and using this British politeness and tea, like, oh, it's time for tea here in the middle of the woods. That's the warrior mentality that was Canada, and Trudeau Sr. completely whitewashed it.
Well, and what's interesting, this sort of ties in with the ethnic ecumenical theme we had going a little bit earlier. I've read a number of these books. American Special Forces people have written American Spartan, the Marcus Luttrell one, Where Men Win Glory, about the football player. Well, not that one in this particular case, but there are all these stories of American and Canadian and other special forces soldiers, the sort of manly men that, Davis, you were alluding to earlier, us needing. And they go over and they come into contact with the Pashtun tribes people, who are usually not ISIS or Taliban. They're just tribesmen doing their thing. And in many cases, they feel more at home in that culture than they felt at home in the American culture they had left from, which is sort of an interesting thing. There's a brotherhood in the warrior groups, even on the other sides of the battlefield, that those warriors don't necessarily feel at home. And I'm not sure if that's just an interesting observation or if it's a problem that we need to figure out.
Kaku comments, the Canadian bullets are polite, Davis. Top 10 is better than none. Yeah, it's actually, there's a huge number of Canadians in the mercenary field. A lot of Canadian soldiers, like, our military is completely underfunded, but we do have very, very good soldiers. And I'm not saying this to disrespect. Like, listen, the American military, you guys got all the toys and all the bells and whistles. There's a lot of Canadians that go into mercenary work afterwards, simply because Canadians are very psychologically oriented towards war. It's why we're so polite all the time, because guys that know how to kill each other don't mouth each other off. And you know,
to address Chris's point, I believe a possible explanation for what you were describing about, Canadian American warriors feeling at home with the Pashtun tribesmen is because our society no longer seems to value the warrior caste, as it were.
Right. I think so. And your sword display for your avatar seems to fit very nicely with Davis's comments about the politeness of warrior caste. The samurai were immaculate in their etiquette, right? But even including the act of killing you, they would be very polite about it.
I think it's part of the reason people really like anime in these circles. Well, partly because it has that warrior ethos in it, but also because anime has not been deracinated. All of our media has been bleached of meaning. Like, Transformers is designed not for an American audience. It's designed for a global audience. So there's no mythology in it anymore. When you read Beowulf, you are steeped in mythology and history. When you watch anime, you are steeped in mythology and history. But with our modern storytelling, it's just so empty. It's robots and explosions, and that's all it is.
Well, it's the most generic type of mythology. They've taken any sort of real identity out of it. And a lot of that is purely just dollars and cents because they want to appeal to the Chinese market because it's the largest.
Well, I think the people making this entertainment, making the art for our civilization, don't know what our civilization is. And we could go into triple brackets if you want to, but what? Oh, I think I just saw a racist fly through the room. But yeah, this is not European art. I mean, even like Star Wars is like one of the best examples, and yet it is so shallow. Star Wars, listen, Luke Skywalker, it's great, okay, but there you scratch past the surface and there's nothing there. It's just a patina. It's gold plated. It's not solid.
It's just a worse Tolkien.
Exactly. Now you do get the American cowboy mythos. You get like Unforgiven, absolutely amazing. You get there's a lot of really great cowboy movies.
3:10 to Yuma.
Oh yeah, that was enjoyable.
That was, in my opinion, one of the best westerns to come out in the last 10 years.
You know, one of the sad things with so there's this place where I buy my cigarettes, and I get along. I really like the staff there, and I was joking about how how Justin Trudeau needs to be put to death by breaking on the wheel for being a traitor to Canada. And she responded to me, "You can't say that." I'm like, yeah, I fucking can. It's Canada. I can say anything I want. I even said to there's a white guy in line behind me. I'm like, do you think freedom of speech covers me saying that Trudeau should be tried for treason and then broken on the wheel? And he's like, he was kind of shocked, obviously, but he said, well, yeah, that's freedom of speech.
But I don't know if I'm unfamiliar with your Canadian laws. You don't really have freedom of speech, at least is how Americans define it.
No, but Canadians think we do. Because we come from the same European tradition. It's freedom of speech, it's enshrined in the Constitution of America, but freedom of speech has a very long history throughout Europe. And
but look at what happened in the UK. It's completely gone.
Well, last I checked, the UK is not white. This was a lovely woman. I really like her, but she is not Canadian.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the things I've noticed that brought me around to the idea that the descendants of African slaves are American. I spoke at one of the Northwest Forums, which is a sort of event associated with countercurrents. And the time that I spoke, there was a member of an organization known as Hope Not Hate infiltrating in attendance, and he wrote a long piece about it. And he was interviewed by NPR. He was from Sweden. And when he was talking with NPR, he said, oh, these people should not be allowed to say these things, and so on. And there was another European woman, I think the same week, who said more or less the same thing. These people should not be allowed to say this. And the same week that both of these people were giving their reports on the alt-right and so on, there were two black guys, both Americans, giving a talk on this. And one of them was a TED Talk. One of them was interviewed on This American Life, who was a former Proud Boy and a friend of Gavin McInnes. And both of them strongly disagreed with the alt-right and what it stood for and its values and all this stuff. But both of those black guys were coming at the issue from the perspective of, look, I get why these angry white guys or whatever, I get why they're frustrated. And
I know where you're coming from.
Yeah, and they strongly disagreed and they wanted to stop it. But their solution was to have the debate and to what was respectful of the freedom of speech in a way that these white Europeans were not respectful of freedom of speech. And when I saw the juxtaposition of the European versus the American attitude, somewhat transcending the racial thing, and this is not to say that race doesn't matter, but there's another dimension to national identity that these two black guys understood at a subconscious level, even, that these Europeans just did not.
I got another super chat from EC2189 Kaku. Also, Canada got crazy animation. Personal opinion, that's repressed urge to kill. TV, hockey, and firepower keep you guys warm. Royale debatable. It's, I mean, yeah, Canada's quite cucked out these days, but it's there. You know, I was toying with an idea. I never wound up writing this article, but blood nationalism, that you need to, tears, sweat, and blood is what earns you the right to a land. And so few of us are putting that in. One of the things that, you know, I don't really want to shit on Cantwell, but I'm going to. One of the things that bugged me is he had this whole segment on his radio show where they were telling, you know, racial jokes about, look at blacks, they're so stupid. I'm like, dude, why are you doing that? Why? What is the constructive product of this? Making, like, do you not have any, do you have so little a love of your own race that you need to attack another race to feel any love for it? It's deeply unproductive, and it's cruel. And I'm sorry, I don't want to be part of a cruel race that treats others like lessers.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, a sort of protege of Cantwell's, who I'm lucky to have as a friend and acquaintance, who's gone another direction, is a guy named Dave Martell.
That's a delicious name.
Yeah, that's what I tell him every time I talk to them. But he sort of started off with Cantwell back when Cantwell was more of a libertarian. But rather than going the super, like the NatSoc route, he went what I think is possibly even a more far right route, which is like, I'm going to focus on family and start making my friends meme about Sunday night dinners with family and talking about spirituality and really directing the gaze inward rather than outward. And that seems to have taken him a lot farther than it has Cantwell, just from an outside observer's perspective.
Well, and I've been lucky enough to have Haythrun join me. And folks, I've been alluding to this. This is the direction that we're heading in. Okay, this is not Sargon of Akkad, this week in feminism stupid. This is not, let's go get a tiki torch rally. Half of you guys are going to go to prison, but I'm going to feel like a hero. Guys, this is not just, we're commenting on things that are going on in the world. We are trying to build something. We are trying to build it for you and with you. That's what we're doing. And it's a gradual process, nothing big to announce just yet. But it's coming to become better men ourselves, becoming real men ourselves, and networking and taking care of one another. You make the leader look good, and he can take care of you. Super chat from Gregory W. Trump SS. Aurini, how many never used tiki torches do you own? I own more skulls than I own tiki torches. Let's just leave it at that.
Tiki torches are great for barbecues.
Something I can say on that point, Aurini, is we did have a moot yesterday, my local folk and I, and we are moving forward with some initiatives, and I'm going to share that with you. So offline, you know, you and I can discuss that. So some things are moving forward.
Guys, my hand is finally at the point where I can type. Again, they pulled the pins out. Oh, I haven't told you guys this. I told you, Steele, on your stream. I don't know if everyone heard it, though. So I go in for surgery. Well, not even surgery. I go in, and it's like, yep, okay. And he just grabs a pair of pliers and pulls the pins out of my hand with no warning. It was terrifying. It didn't hurt. It just, like, I felt the tug, obviously, because the things are embedded in my finger bones. But he just pulled the damn things out with pliers. I said to the guy afterwards, like, Jesus Christ, here I was worrying that the plague was going to hit before our appointment, and I was going to be trying to cut down the swaths of locust with my bastard sword with one hand, because I could have pulled these damn things out myself. And he said, well, I would have preferred that you didn't pull them out yourself. So pins are out of my hand. I still don't have that much mobility. The hand is very stiff, like the first two knuckles feel all gluey, like there's something slowing them down. But I can type again, which means you're going to be seeing a little bit more of me online, and that I am going to finish that book that I'm writing for you guys.
Well, that's good to hear. Always good to keep your hand, unlike Tyr or Mucius Scaevola or any of those other hand sacrificers throughout history.
Tyr was merciful. Although I will confess, while I was waiting for the Ambo to show up with the 2 broken fingers, I was thinking to myself, how awesome would it be if my whole hand got torn off and I still managed to do this?
There was a great story, and I have to get going after this, but there was a fantastic story of an Australian surfer who was accosted by a shark, rather roughly, took his leg off. And supposedly, the story he was telling the helicopter pilots who pulled him out was that he had wrestled the leg back from the shark and then beat the shark to death with his own leg.
That is excellent.
The helicopter pilots didn't believe it. They believed he was delusional. Took him to the hospital, and he, stitched him up. Later, I want to say a couple days later, in a routine patrol, they found a shark that appeared to have died from blunt force trauma to the head. And they're like, my God, I think he might have been telling the truth.
That's the guy I want to buy.
Alpha as fuck.
Yeah.
All right, we've been going for way too long because this conversation has been great. So, yeah, Christopher.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to all of you. And I look forward to seeing the work you guys do in the future.
Excellent. There's a link down below to. Now he's writing on you. Do you write exclusively on countercurrents?
I write mostly for my own blog at caffeineandphilosophy.com, and I've got 1 book out, a 2nd book coming out, hopefully before September. We will see about that.
Okay, I'm going to edit the links down below. I only have a link to your countercurrents articles, but
Okay.
we will link to those. And by the way, I didn't even realize that you were Caffeine and Philosophy.
Oh yeah, that's me, the best drug and the most fun pastime.
Hey, Throom, you have any final thoughts?
Another great chat. Was a pleasure meeting you, Christopher, and I'm definitely going to check out your website. The website for my folk building effort here in Pittsburgh is called The Free Folk, and you can check us out at freefolk.org. Learn a little bit more about Indo-European philosophy, folkway, and spirituality, and what we do here. And yeah, I'll be bringing more information to Aurini's show about that as it unfolds.
Oh
So
man, your website looks even better than mine.
Well, I'm a professional designer, so that kind of helps.
Looks excellent. We'll definitely check that out.
Thank you.
Steele, you've started live streaming again fairly regularly, haven't you?
Yes, I have. After a lot of cajoling from friends like yourself, I've gotten back into it. You can find me on YouTube. Put John Steele Show, excuse me, John Steele Show into the YouTube search engine, and my channel will pop up. And I'm going to be interviewing Hedron soon. Now that your computer apparently is back up and running, because we had to put that on delay.
Yeah.
So we'll have to, when we get offline, we'll hopefully be able to schedule that.
And
Sure.
his Twitter is John_Steele99.
Yes.
And Forney, you have some sort of like writing website or something, right?
Yeah, it's called Terror House Magazine, terrorhousemag.com, twitter.com/terrorhousemag. We got a big announcement related to Terror House that will, I know I've been teasing this for like the past couple weeks, but we'll finally be ready to make this announcement possibly tomorrow, definitely before the end of this week. So go to terrorhousemag.com, twitter.com/terrorhousemag. Also, mattforney.com and youtube.com/user/realmattforney.
And may I say one more thing?
Yes, please.
I just want to thank everybody who's keeping my mom in their thoughts and prayers. I greatly appreciate it, and I know she would too. She is a Catholic, so anybody who wants to pray in the traditional Catholic tradition for her, I know she would appreciate that.
Guys, thank you to everybody that joined tonight. I think it was a great conversation. That's why it went too long. There's Caffeine and Philosophy tossed into the chat. I will edit the description below to add that as well. God bless all of you guys. Keep the faith and stick to your guns. Keep your powder dry. And, the meek shall inherit the earth. I've talked about this before. Meek does not mean the weak. When it was written, meek meant those that knew when to keep their swords sheathed and knew when to draw them. it's not time to draw our swords yet. We don't need another Charlottesville. But guys, every single one of us here, we know what's coming. So, Deus Volt. Aurini out.